Yep, okay, thank you. Are you live now? He did put you on.
Hello. Yep.
Now what do I do with it? Oh, there it is. My introduction here. Well, good morning if it's not noon. I've been waiting for Daryl in a different place and he got here so early. We didn't make connections. However, thank you all for being here, and I think you'll be very glad to be a part of the class this morning. So we welcome Daryl. By way of introduction, I might just say that this book of his is Humble, Humble, and you'll notice the letters U-M-E, you and me. And I think that has something to do with why he chose that word for the book that he has written. Bear with me as I read the qualifications and the characteristics, and the credits are long. Dr. Daryl Van Tongeren has participated in writing up to 100 books and articles on the subject of humility. He has been named one of 43 fellows of the Association for Psychological Science and was the only honoree from a liberal arts college, which U.S. News and World Report ranks in the top national liberal arts colleges for 2024, including Hope, where Daryl is a renowned associate professor of psychology. Go Hope. He is also director of Hope's Frost Center for Social Science. He earned his PhD in experimental social psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University, following an MA from the University of Colorado and a BA from Colorado Christian U. The New York Times lists Daryl among its best-selling authors. He is a leading researcher on the science of humility, interested in deep, enduring questions about the human condition, and typical of the nature of his work are such topics as the social benefits of humility, cultural humility, combating meaninglessness, intergroup forgiveness, understanding of religious tolerance, self-control and forgiveness, and making decisions to understand, forgive, and tolerate. Quite an agenda. Just yesterday, I learned about a high school exchange student to the United States who might have provided Daryl with a mini study of tolerance, understanding, and humility. A Muslim from Saudi Arabia, he was eventually placed in a Jewish home and attended a Roman Catholic school. While Daryl can explain some of the issues for that young man and us, he cannot do the understanding and applications. So let's listen to learn. Daryl, please take us on your deep dive into humility.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow, what an introduction. I feel like we've got no place to go but down from there. But grateful to be here. Grateful to share a little bit about humility with you all. Like I mentioned, I was really fortunate to be able to write a book about humility, but I will start off by saying, while I might be a content expert on humility, it doesn't mean that I've personally mastered it yet. And if you do not think that that is true, you can ask my friends or my wife, and they'll let you know that. So you might be wondering, why do we need humility today? Like, why is this an important topic? Because some people have said, well, humility seems like kind of this ancient virtue that people aren't thinking about anymore. And I would say that most people are not thinking about this anymore. One of the problems is that the United States is undergoing what social scientists call a narcissism epidemic. And so levels of narcissism or self-focused have been increasingly growing over the past 50 years. We're more enamored with ourselves and addicted to self-esteem than we've ever been before. And the problem is it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to interact with people with whom we disagree. So whether it's how we get our news, because it's filtered if you get your news online, whether you block friends online or simply refuse to affiliate with people who don't hold the same religious or political views than you. We're coming into the holidays, right, which used to be this great time where you would drink too much eggnog and eat too much food. But now the holidays are a time in which you get into these ideological disagreements with relatives, right? And you And there's that odd uncle who holds those beliefs that are very different than you. They become very stressful. The problem is that most of us refuse to see the world as it is, and we prefer to see the world as we want it to be. So the end result is that we're entrenched in a rather biased, selfish way of engaging the world. So we're convinced that we're not as bad as other people, but the end result is that we're more lonely, anxious, depressed, and miserable than we've ever been. So I think that it would be fair to say that if we were to take a temperature of the United States heading into 2024, we would all agree that there's this great amount of cultural dis-ease, right? We're kind of uncomfortable, we're unable to get along, tensions are quite high. Now, I'm going to make a modest, pun intended, proposition that maybe what we need is we all need a strong dose of humility. I actually think that humility is a possible one of the possible solutions. It's not the only possible solution, but it's one of the possible solutions for kind of navigating this rising narcissism epidemic and our inability to get along with other people. Now, it stands in direct opposition to strong cultural currents, right? We live the way that our culture rewards behavior is very much that you need to be at the center of whatever's going on. You need to make sure you're managing your brand. Other people, affirm you. But humility is strongly countercultural to that. So before we get too far, I had a very wise advisor who said fountainheads or definitions are the fountainheads of knowledge. So we need to define what it is that we're talking about. So what is humility? Humility is being the right size in any given situation. So one way about thinking about humility is it's being the right size in any given situation. So for those of you who like philosophy, and especially virtue ethics, you might remember Aristotle's golden mean. If you don't like Aristotle, and that's totally fine, you might remember Goldilocks. You remember Goldilocks? So she stumbles in, you've got the porridge, you've got too hot, too cold, and just right. Humility is about Goldilocks or Aristotelian virtues. So it's about being just the right size. So imagine this, you go into a meeting and you're fairly, well equipped as the expert in this meeting, and there's other people in this room and you're joining a group. Okay, one mistake you can make is you could be too small. Another mistake you can make is you could be too big. Now, most of us realize that one of the biggest threats to humility is being too big. We would call this arrogance, right? So you go into this meeting and you say, well, it's a good thing you invited me here. I am the expert and I'm going to save the day, right? And you ignore everyone else's expertise or everything that they've done to that moment, and you assume that you're the best. Clearly, that's not humility. Now, that's usually where people stop thinking about humility. And they say, oh, well, the thing about humility is I need to think that I'm nothing, right? I need to think that I'm the absolute worst. Well, if you're too small, that's not humility either. We would call that servility, or we'd call that self-deprecation, right? So you also wouldn't want to go into a situation where you're the expert being brought in and they say, well, what do you think? Oh, I don't know. Who am I, right? I'm nobody, right? In the same way, I'm imagining if I'm going in for a very important procedure and my brain surgeon were to come in and sit down on the chair next to me and we're getting ready for the operation, and she looks over at me and says, yeah, what do you think I should do here? That's not what I want to hear from my brain surgeon, right? That's not humility. That would be me leaving and finding someone else to do my surgery. So humility is about being the right size, not too big, not too small. So it's about avoiding the ditches, right? So the first time a colleague of mine gave a presentation on humility, one of the students we were working with came in and saw the humility title on the screen, and he said, oh, humility, that's the thing I'm the best at. I bet I'm going to contribute a lot to this conversation. Okay, so he probably needed to dial it down a little. He needed to be a little smaller. But on the other hand, a lot of people think they don't have anything to offer, right? And they're too small. And so one of the reasons why humility has really gotten a bad rap over the years is because of this misunderstanding of humility. Usually it's because people have misused and abused humility to keep people who aren't in power out of power. right? So, and usually this falls on people who are more marginalized. So women or people who are not of privileged identities, they're told, oh, just be humble, right? We don't need to hear your opinion. You should just be humble. Again, that's not humility. Humility is about being the right size in any given situation. All right, let's take a little bit of a closer look at humility. Research on humility, at least in psychology, has been accelerating for at least a decade, maybe a little bit more. And research kind of converges that humility has two dimensions. So there's an intrapersonal thing. There's something that happens inside of you. And inside of you, it involves an accurate view of yourself. So this includes knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. And it requires you to admit the limitations of your belief. So basically admitting what you don't know or that you don't know. It's very hard right now to be in a society where we say, yeah, I don't know. And I will say as a college professor, where literally my job means to profess, right? That's what they're paying me to do. And students come in as if I'm some type of knowledge dispenser. For them to ask me a question, it's not easy for me to say, I don't know. They're like, well, why am I paying you an exorbitant tuition, right? You should know this. But it requires us to realize that we don't know everything, right? Most of us, this is where, don't worry, this talk will become increasingly less comfortable as we go on, because I'm gonna encourage you to think about the ways in which humility is challenging for all of us. None of us have the corner market on truth, right? Would we agree that none of us fully knows the whole truth? Most of us have beliefs that are in error, or at least all of our beliefs are partially in error, right? So none of us fully know. So we all have to admit that we don't know. Now, if when I was telling you that most of us have beliefs that are in error, most of you are agreeing, but most of you are probably also thinking, yeah, but I'm not as much in error as the other people with whom I disagree on the other side of the aisle politically, or the other church, or the people who don't go to church. They're really in error. I'm kind of in error, right? But I'm like less in error than they are. If that's the way you're thinking, guess what? They're thinking the same thing, right? So we all need more humility by realizing we all have limitations in our beliefs. The second thing it means is prioritizing or thinking about the needs of other people. It requires for us to restrain our ego to have respectful interactions with other people, and then prioritizing the relationship over proving that you're right. This one is tough. Most of us want to win the argument. But I learned this my very first year of marriage. Sometimes if you fight to win the argument, it's not the best for the relationship. So I remember the first disagreement my wife and I got into. Oh, I came like I was practicing to be a lawyer. I had all of my points all laid out. I won the fight, but I probably lost in the end, right? And so many of us try to go in interactions with other people to prove that we're right, because there's so much at stake. Our ego is at stake. Heaven forbid that we're wrong. And what happens to the relationship? It dissolves. And then what good is it that you're right and you're completely alone and no one wants to be with you because everyone thinks that you're a smug jerk, right? Like that doesn't seem like a healthy way to interact with others. Okay, so here's what we know. It's intrapersonally having an accurate view of yourself, interpersonally restraining your selfish ego, respectfully interacting with other people, and prioritizing relationships over being right. Now, research has suggested that there's 4 different types of humility, and we're going to take a look at each of these in turn. So there's relational humility, which has to do with how we interact with other people. There's intellectual humility, which has to do with our ideas or our beliefs. There's cultural humility, which has to do with our kind of ways of understanding life or kind of cultural interactions. And then there's something called existential humility, and this has to do with our ultimate questions about God or the universe. So let's look at each one of these. So relational humility requires us to be self-aware, knowing your strengths and your weaknesses, including the areas where you could grow. None of us are amazing at everything we do. We all have some limitations. There's always areas where we could grow and get better. It means being fair. So sharing the praise and accepting your portion of the blame. I usually like to do the opposite of this. I usually like to accept the praise. I love accepting praise. But then when there's blame to go around, well, I wasn't the only one working on the project, right? Other people are to blame as well. But what we should do is, if you get praise, say, well, there were other people working on the project, they should be praised as well. And if there's blame, well, I contributed as well. I need to take responsibility. It means being respectful, so interacting in a way that shows others how much you value them. And it really means being empathic. So putting the needs of other people as the same as your own. So not more than you, not less than you, but the same as you. You view other people as equals, and so you would necessarily want to put their needs as equal to yours. One of the ways that we researchers have gone about measuring humility is we ask someone's family and friends, how humble is that person? Right? Because you can imagine the nightmare that might come about if you ask someone to rate their own humility. Right? If I were to say on a scale of 1 to 10 how humble you are, and you give me an 8, well, I don't know what to do with that. Like, are you really just self-aware of how humble you are? Or would a really humble person say they're a 5 because they can grow? Would only a narcissist give themselves that high of a score? So one way that we go about doing this is we just ask other people. And if we ask enough other people, we can kind of get an average of how humble you are in different situations. So that's relational humility. Intellectual humility means being intellectually open. So avoiding dogmatism and being willing to revise your beliefs. So we all have beliefs. We don't like changing our beliefs, but occasionally we have to. Being open to revise them is a sign of intellectual humility. It means being curious, so seeking new ideas, new ways to expand and grow, changing your mind to align with strong evidence. We're going to talk about this later on in the presentation, but if there are things for which you will never, ever, ever change your mind, that's okay to have a few of those. If you have a lot of those, if you have and I'm saying maybe more than you can count on one hand, I'm not sure that you're necessarily being intellectually open and curious, right? If every belief you have is the absolute belief you would never change because you could never be wrong, that feels kind of closed-minded and dogmatic to me. It means being realistic, so owning and admitting your flaws and limitations and seeing the world as it is rather than the way we want it to be. Then it also means being teachable. So when you realize you have made a mistake or you don't have the right answer, you're open to that feedback and you're non-defensive, then you can change your behavior to align with that new knowledge. A third type of humility is cultural humility. This looks like being thoughtful, so not viewing your cultural way of life as superior. Okay, so what this means is if you meet someone from a different way of life, a different culture, you don't pity them. You don't try to make them live their life the way you're living yours, because you understand your way of life is not necessarily superior. It means being a learner, someone who's curious about the cultures of others. You want to learn what other people might have to contribute. It means being respectful, so treating other people as equals, even when there are differences or disagreements. And it also looks like seeing diversity as a strength. So viewing diversity as something that strengthens communities, that our differences are a tapestry that makes us stronger, not something that highlights how we're all different and of different value. Okay, the last humility is what's called existential humility. So with existential humility, I'll just kind of frame this with a story real quick. My wife and I were traveling I had a conference in Norway, and my wife did some research and found that if you fly Icelandic Air, you can go from the United States to Europe, or certain parts of Europe, with a layover in Iceland. And in fact, that layover doesn't cost any more money. You can stay for 1 to 7 days for the same price of an airline ticket. Now, I thought this is an amazing deal, and it is, except for the fact that Iceland is ridiculously expensive, so they just want you to go there and spend all of your money. Not a problem. So we decided to do a 3-day layover in Iceland because we always wanted to see Iceland, and my wife always wanted to see the Northern Lights. So we were going during the summer. The chances weren't very high we were going to see the Northern Lights, but she had 2 different websites. One, she was kind of tracking the aurora forecast, and the other was some guy's website that if you use some longitude and latitude, it put us in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere outside of Reykjavik. So it's our first night there. We didn't sleep on the way over. We're very tired. And she says, well, tonight at 2 a.m., there's like a 12% chance we're going to see the Northern Lights, but we'd have to leave Reykjavik at midnight, drive out into the middle of nowhere into an abandoned, pull off the road and see the Northern Lights. So naturally, I was incredibly grumpy and put up a big stink. But then she's like, well, you can just stay here and sleep. I'm gonna go see the Northern Lights. So she convinced me. So we go middle of the night, we pull off in this parking lot. There's one other car kind of over the side who must have also seen this same weird website that we saw. And we were sitting in our car for about half an hour, and I was kind of getting increasingly more curmudgeon-y and agitated because nothing was happening. So then we get out of the car and we're looking around. And then, out of nowhere, the most beautiful set of lights just opened up around us. And it honestly felt like heaven was just opening all the way around us. And for about half an hour, it was the most vibrant colors I've ever seen in my entire life. And I will say that is probably the closest I ever felt to like the divine presence of God in that moment. I mean, my wife and I, we were just so overwhelmed with emotion. There was really nothing else that you could do in that moment. And it was also one of those moments where I felt so incredibly small. And it felt really good to be that small. Like sometimes we don't like feeling small, but it felt really good to feel that almost insignificant in the world. It's almost like if I make a mistake, it's okay because, it's not that big of a deal. So it was after that I started thinking about what would it look like to be humble, kind of humble before God, or humble in light of like these big existential questions. So I think part of it means being in awe, right? Kind of appreciating this wonder of the vast world that's around us. Feeling appropriate smallness. So embracing that our right size is sometimes rather small, and that's okay. I also sometimes get this feeling when I spend time in nature. So when I'm walking around trees that have been here long before I was here and will be here long after I'm gone, it just provides me with comfort. When you're at the Grand Canyon or you see some very kind of large natural wonder or beauty, it just kind of helps put things back into perspective. I think it also means accepting our human finitude and frailty. So we're not very good at accepting the limits of being human, right? We want everything. We want to be able to do everything and be good at everything and live forever. But we all have limits and we all have this abounded nature of being human. And that's okay. That's just part of being human. And I think the natural result of this at the end is that if we experience the sense of awe and smallness, I think we're just going to feel grateful. I think that's the only appropriate response, is feeling grateful. When my wife and I drove back to where we were staying in Reykjavik, it took us a while before we could talk and try to process what we had experienced, but mostly we just said how grateful we were for being able to experience that. And I was no longer upset and grumpy about missing out on sleep. Somehow it was all okay. All right, I want to check in real quick. Any questions about what we've talked about so far before we go into why humility might be important? Okay, so why is humility important? So sometimes when researchers study something like humility, we have to prove that what we're studying is actually good, right? It's a good thing for humanity. So one of the strongest areas of evidence that research has found is that humility is really good for relationships. So my very first study that I ever did on humility, we made these fake dating profiles, kind of like personal ads. And we had one personal ad that was someone that was humble and one that was someone that was a little arrogant. And what we found is overwhelmingly, people want to be with the partner that's humble. Right. So despite the fact that the way that a lot of people are trying to attract romantic partners is, take a picture without your shirt on, with, flexing your muscles or behind, all your money. That's not what people actually want in long-term committed relationships. They want someone who's humble. We found that people are more likely to forgive someone who's humble. You might imagine that's true because if you're with someone who's arrogant and doesn't care about you, you're going to wonder, are you going to treat me bad again in the future? People are more satisfied with humble partners and more committed to humble partners. And so what this tells us is that humility is a signal to other people of how you're likely to treat them if you're in a relationship with them, if you're in this trusted relationship. So if you see someone and they're humble, you realize, I think I can trust them, right? They're going to value me. They're going to listen to me. They're going to be respectful to me. So the first thing that researchers found is that humility is important because it's good for relationships. The second reason why humility is really important, and I think this is very timely right now, it smooths conflict and power struggles. So my colleagues and I call this the social oil hypothesis. Think about an engine running on really high RPM, right? Oil kind of smooths things out. It kind of keeps the relational wear and tear from building up. So there's other researchers have studied like what makes really good leaders. And Jim Collins has this book called Good to Great, and it talks about level 5 leaders. And level 5 leaders are the ones that they're demanding, they can push their team, but they're also humble, right? And you can kind of get away with that if you let people know that you care about them. So people prefer humble leaders. It allows them to be harder driving. There's been research showing that therapists that are humble have much better outcomes with their clients. You can imagine how important that would be. If you're not listening to your client, you're probably not going to be able to help them very well. And it also reduces intergroup conflict and aggression. So people that are more humble are less likely to get defensive when threatened or criticized by people who don't share their views. So really we think about humility as reducing relational wear and tear. The third thing that humility does is it improves your well-being. So this is called like the well-being hypothesis of humility. So people who are humble have a greater ability to engage in diverse perspectives. They're more open to evidence about the way that the world is rather than being defensive, have a greater willingness to learn. But we really wanted to put this to the test. So we did a couple of studies where we really wanted to see people who were really stressed out. But what we wanted to do was to show that being humble would kind of help protect people from experiencing stress. So we were kind of talking about this and like, well, how can you ever predict when someone's going to be stressed out? Like that's kind of a tall order. And our advisor said, well, one thing that's almost universally stressful is having your first child. And so we're like, oh, okay, we should do that. So what we did is we recruited couples who were in their 3rd trimester of having their first baby. Okay, and they took a whole bunch of assessments and they signed up for this 2-year study. So they were still in the bliss of everything's going to be fine. I'm sure that we're going to handle this well. Then we followed up when the baby was 3 months, 9 months, and 21 months. And what we found over this 2-year study was that over that transition to parenthood, if both partners were humble, they reported less stress, less depression, less anxiety. But it only happened when both partners were humble. If one partner was humble and one wasn't, you don't see those benefits, right? Because probably what's ending up happening, the humble partner is running around doing everything, and the arrogant partner is like, man, being a parent is so much hard work, right? But they don't realize that the humble partner is the one carrying all the load. So when both partners were humble, they had better reactions to stress. We also wanted to test this, not just in the transition to parenthood, but we did another study that I promised we got ethics approval for. We had another study where we brought couples into the lab, and we asked them to write down the area where they had the most persistent disagreement between the two of them. Okay, so like, what's the thing you always fight about? So they each wrote that down. Then while we were kind of sifting through that, we hooked them up to blood pressure cuffs because we wanted to see their cardiovascular responses. So then we came back and we said, okay, good news. You're going to discuss on camera in front of us the area of disagreement you always get into a fight about. And you're going to do it for 10 minutes and we're going to video record you. And we're also going to have you hooked up to these machines. Again, what we found was when both partners were humble, they had a better physiological cardiovascular response to stress. So some of you are thinking exactly what I'm about to say. Not only do you need to be humble, but it's important that your partner is also humble. So some of you came with a partner today and you're nudging each other as you're listening. You're like, see, this is important for both of us. Some of you don't have a partner here and you're going to go tell your partner, you better get humble too, because it better not just be me. So Humility is good for the mind and the body. Well, what's the key to humility? I'm going to argue that the key to humility is a sense of psychological security. What do I mean by this? We usually get defensive when we feel like we're under attack, right? And so what we do is we marshal the defenses to protect our ego. Usually, though, our egos are a little overinflated. And the reason why I say a little overinflated is because they're so overinflated. If I were to tell you they're so overinflated, you'd be mad at me right now and say, no, they're not, right? So they're a little overinflated. All of us, myself included, have an overinflated ego. And when someone disagrees with us, we feel threatened. Why? The reason we feel threatened is because we've misplaced our self-worth. We've put our self-worth in the hands of other people. We've put our self-worth into external contingencies. What do I mean by that? We've told ourselves, I'm not worth enough unless I have so-and-so's approval, or I have this much money in my bank account, or I've done this many successful things in my career, or this many people sing my praises. But none of those things actually will give you self-worth. So the key to developing psychological security, which will be the key to developing humility, is to have what's called non-contingent self-worth. This is us realizing that we are people of worth and value by default. There's nothing you can do to be more worthy, more loved, more than the already enough that you are. Right? And so when we place our worth in other people's hands, we're always going to be reactive to defend because we are not in control of our sense of self-worth. But when we realize you're already enough, you're already worthy, you're already loved, if someone says, well, I disagree with you, okay, that's fine, right? Well, you didn't, you don't do enough at work. Okay, okay, thanks for the feedback, right? If you're tying your self-worth to things you can't control, you're always going to be reactive and defensive. If you already realize that you're a person of worth and value, it takes that edge off and you're less defensive. Another place that I think this is really important, and I think it's important whenever I talk to faith groups, whenever I talk to churches, we also need to realize this is going to be hard, but hang in there with me. We're also more than our beliefs. Our beliefs do not define or give us our worth. Some of you are like, wait a minute, but our beliefs are important. They are, right? But we are not our beliefs. Because how many of you have ever changed your mind in your life? Anyone ever changed your, okay, yes. So some of you have changed your mind. So if you don't believe the same things now that you do back then were you not you back then than you are now, right? If you are your beliefs, right? We're more than our beliefs, and our beliefs will change. If you're lucky, your beliefs will change again in another 2 to 3 to 4 years from now, right? So we need to shift where our worth comes from not, right? It's not from having the right set of beliefs or the right set of attitudes. It's our worth just comes from, comes from God, right? It just comes from this source that's not contingent on other people. Okay, well, how do you cultivate humility? I've told you it's kind of important. I should probably suggest ways that we can become a little bit more humble. The first thing that you can do is you can seek feedback. And this includes seeking feedback from a trusted source. So someone you know is going to tell you the truth. So don't ask someone that's going to, just say, oh yeah, you're great. You want someone who's actually going to tell you the truth. So I did this with my wife. So that very first study that I ever did about dating profiles, some journalists wanted to write some story for Men's Health. They thought, oh, this is great. Like the nice guy wins. And so it was my first interview on humility. So naturally, my overinflated ego was like, finally, I'm getting the attention that I deserve for my great research. So it was on a Friday during the summer, and I had promised my wife that we were going to go to the beach. And we were going to leave at, I don't know, let's say 10 o'clock so we could get a good spot down at the beach. But I took the interview at 10 o'clock, and I told her it's only going to take 15 minutes. So my wife was like, okay, that's fine. It took an hour and 15 minutes for this interview. So my wife was waiting for an hour and 15 minutes. She packed the lunches. She packed the towel. She was ready to go. The interviewer said at the very end, what would be really cool is I'm curious if, because you study humility, if your wife if you're any more humble. And I was like, well, I could just ask my wife. And you're like, oh yeah, Like, yeah, my wife will be able to tell me if I'm any more humble because I study humility. She's like, okay, that's great. Let me know what your wife says. So my wife has been waiting for an hour and 15 minutes, even though I promised her I wouldn't take an interview, and then I did. And then instead of being 15 minutes, it was an hour and 15 minutes. So I come upstairs from our basement, and before I can say anything, now the background of this is I was also training for a marathon at the time, and we live, just about a mile south of here. I told my wife, can I meet you at the beach? Because I want to get a workout in. So I'm going to run from here to the beach. It's like 7 miles. I'll meet you there. Oh yeah, by the way, how humble am I on a scale of 1 to 10? Well, she gave me a 4 out of 10. But then, yeah, exactly. Then she said, wait. She's like, is 1 high or is 1 low? So I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll still be above, halfway. I said, 1 is low and, 10 is high. He's like, oh yeah, you're definitely a 4. So, but truthfully, it was probably generous. I was probably less than a 4 at that time, right? But now when my wife gave me that feedback, right, because we have to seek that feedback, don't do what I did. I got really defensive. It's like, well, come on. I mean, I was doing this interview because that's going to be, So first thing you do, seek feedback. Second of all, work to reduce your defensiveness. So if you ask people, how humble am I? You have to be prepared for what they're going to tell you. You may not like it. I did not like it. But I will tell you this. I think about that conversation regularly. And this conversation happens 5, 6, 7 years ago. I mean, it was a long time ago. And I regularly think about how easy it is for me to just slip into a normal pattern of kind of just thinking about myself, right? The way the metaphor I like to use is, at the airports, they have those moving sidewalks. Every day we wake up, the moving sidewalk is moving towards selfishness. It's just moving toward narcissism. If I'm not actively walking against the moving sidewalk, it's just going to be easy for me to fall into that trap. The third thing we can do is we can really try to build empathy. In that moment with my wife, I was not being empathic. So empathy might be the cornerstone of humility. It means I can imagine what her perspective would be, and I can emotionally put myself in her situation. So how would have I felt if my wife said, hey, let me just take this call, it'll take 15 minutes. And then it's an hour and 15 minutes later, and rather than rushing up and saying, oh, I'm so sorry, let's go to the beach, she was like, why don't you do all this other work and I'll see you there in about an hour. I think I'd be pretty frustrated. I'd probably feel a little hurt. But if we can develop empathy, thinking about the needs of others, reflecting on the ways that we're not perfect, that's going to allow us to cultivate humility. And then as we put this into practice, practice is the key. Practice, practice, practice. Again, I've been studying this for over a decade. I think I'm a little bit better at humility than I was before, but I'm not perfect, right? I'm not perfect. It's kind of, the metaphor I use here is kind of like training for a marathon. Running or being humble is kind of like running a marathon. But imagine you've only been on your couch your entire life because you were raised in the United States, right? So you have to get there little bits at a time, right? A little bit at a time. And so you kind of have to work the muscle. The more you work it, the easier it's going to be, the more kind of embedded in your daily routines it's going to be. Okay, I want to dispel some myths about humility because I think these myths are what keep people from being humble. The first myth is that humility is merely lacking conviction. So we've done research that shows people can actually hold beliefs with conviction and do so humbly. So to be humble doesn't mean that you're like, well, I don't know. I don't really know anything about anything, man. I'm just here. That's not what it means at all. But I've learned a lot from Dave Myers, one of my colleagues at Hope College. He has 2 axioms, so 2 things he believes. And he says, these are the 2 things he believes. Everything else is up for revision. His 2 things are, there's a God, it's not me and it's not you, right? Those are the 2 things he believes. But everything else he's willing to revise. So I think that humility is not the belief in nothing. It's believing something until you have enough evidence to believe in something else, right? So believe in something, but then hold that belief loosely enough that if you are convinced and it's sufficiently strong evidence, you can believe something else. It's not about just lacking conviction. Okay, so that's the first myth about humility and why people think, why people get nervous about humility. A second thing that people get nervous about humility is related, and it's not just merely being wishy-washy. Okay, so intellectual humility in particular does not require us to constantly change our beliefs. It just asks us to change our beliefs in light of sufficiently strong evidence. So constant change is not a requirement. You can and should have a high bar for what to change your mind on, but there should be some bar, right? There should be some bar for what it would take for you to change your mind. And we're going to get to this in a minute. If you have no bar for what it would change your mind, you can have a few of those. You get a few of those free passes, but not everything you believe should have no bar. You better never change my mind about this. Pineapple should not be on a pizza, right? Like, no. It's also possible that sometimes interrogating your beliefs does not result in changing them. So if someone says, I really want you to think about why you think that, do that. But sometimes after the end, you're going to realize, yeah, I don't need to change my mind, but I am open to interrogating why I believe that. The third myth is that humility is essentially servility or being too small. It does not require that we align our views to others simply to please them or maintain relational harmony. Now, I did say it means prioritizing the relationship over being right, and I still believe that. But I think that there's a way that you can preserve a relationship while also letting someone that you love know where you stand on something. So it doesn't mean saying like, well, I'm going to go, interact with that weird relative over the holidays. I better just, go along with it. There's probably a balance where you can be respectful, let them know where you stand, hear what they have to say, and then kind of move on. It doesn't require shrinking or ignoring others' earned or ignoring your own earned expertise, because that would be being too small. And the fourth myth is that humility really has no costs whatsoever. Like it's always good all the time. It's not. Okay, I think there are a lot of other people a lot smarter than me that have said what we really need is wisdom to know which virtue to deploy in which situation, right? Humility is one virtue for your tool belt, but it's not the only virtue to use all the time. There might be times in which justice or courage are more important in a situation than humility might be. And then, there might be intrapersonal costs, such as uncertainty, risk of exploitation. So if you're humble and your partner's not, right, that's going to be another risk. All right. I also know that we're getting close on time, so I want to talk shortly about avoiding some pitfalls. Okay, this one is going to be really uncomfortable. Is that okay? So for the next couple minutes, it's going to be very uncomfortable, but I have to tell you this as fellow people of faith. The first thing we have to avoid is what's called creeping moral amplification or sacralization. What do I mean by this? So there are certain beliefs that we say, this is a moral issue. I will never, ever, ever change my mind about this, right? That's okay to have that. There are some of those things we should absolutely have, right? So child abuse, never a good thing. Not going to change my mind about that. I feel pretty resolved. I can interrogate my views and say, yeah, that's always going to be terrible. That is fine. Does that make sense? That is a moral issue to take a moral stand on. Now, the problem arises when we elevate lots of things to that same moral status. And we elevate all kinds of things and say, well, I'm never changing my mind about this too. And it's a problem for two reasons. The first is it kind of waters down the importance of that first thing that you said I'm never changing my mind on. The second thing is if everything is a moral thing, then you're just kind of closed-minded. And you're really not that different than that other group that you're thinking about in your head right now that makes everything a moral thing for them too. Does that make sense? So we have to caution against letting everything get the moral status of I'm never changing my mind about this because I know for certain that I am right. So a question to think about on the way home or on the way to lunch is, what are your essential non-negotiables? How many do you have? Is it more than a few? If it's like a long list, ask yourself what's going on. Okay, here's the second uncomfortable one, but I'll be out of here soon, so then you can forget about me. The second is, I caution us against rearranging our prejudices. William James has one of my favorite quotes. A great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices. What do we mean by this? So I also study, besides humility, I also study religion. But in particular, for the past 5 years, I've been studying people who are leaving religion. And an interesting phenomenon among people leaving religion is some people who leave very fundamentalist, conservative upbringings, right, religious upbringings. They say, I'm leaving this conservative fundamentalist upbringing because they are too close-minded and they just hate the other group, right? If you're not part of the in-group, they hate the out-group, and I will not be part of a group that does that. And so they leave that group. And do you know where a lot of those people end up? Super politically liberal groups that turn and look at the other group and say, I can't believe that group. That group is terrible. I totally dislike that group. They have everything wrong. Their thinking is completely wrong. So what happened is the people are just as fundamental. They're just fundamental about something different. Does that make sense? And so intellectual humility is not simply shifting the target of your vitriol. So if many of you say, oh, I'm so much more evolved and enlightened because I used to hate this group and now I hate that group, right? That's not intellectual humility. That's not respectful interaction. That's just us rearranging our prejudices. So in what ways are you empathic toward understanding those with whom you disagree? When I was writing this book, when I was writing Humble, I had my routine. I would wake up, I would do the Wordle. Anyone else do the Wordle? Love the Wordle. Then I would check my news source. You know what I'm talking about? My news source. I'd get my news for the day, then I'd start writing. And when I was kind of writing like how to be more open-minded, I realized I wasn't even following my advice because I was only checking my news source. So then I took the next step of I checked my news source and I checked the other team's news source. But when I did, I mostly was like, oh, I can't believe they think that. And then I would go on and write it. Over time, though, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but my wife will vouch for me, I actually check a lot of news sources now. And it's not because I want to see what the other team is playing so I can strategize. It's more of I honestly want to think, what are multiple perspectives for seeing a particular issue? I signed up for an email that sends me two sides of the same issue, one from the political left, one from the political right. And I realized that I too was like, whoa, I didn't realize there was a whole other way to be thinking about this. Okay, so in as much as I am here to say, don't rearrange your prejudice, I'm telling myself, it's easy just to start rearranging your prejudice and kind of arrogantly, pompously think, oh, I'm so enlightened, I've really become humble. A third pitfall is when it comes to these existential questions. So our worldviews, like religion, like politics, they provide us with meaning. They help us make sense of the world. And we're psychologically rewarded by holding these beliefs with such conviction, and we're often unwilling to change them because there's simply too much at stake. So my students and I actually did some research showing that when it comes to humility around what people believe about the afterlife, too much humility actually undermines well-being. So if people are really humble about like, yeah, I'm willing to revise my beliefs about what happens to us after we die, they report less well-being because they don't get the psychological security and comfort that comes from knowing for certain what's going to happen. So sometimes we have to figure out, how do we hold our deepest convictions humbly, allowing room for revision? How do we avoid defensiveness? And what I wonder is if we need a sense of existential distress tolerance. So what this means is if you want to be humble and you want to be open, you have to realize you could be wrong, even about your most deepest held convictions. But rather than take that out on other people by being defensive, you have to shoulder that distress that comes with realizing you could be wrong. And just live with that. Build a tolerance that comes from that. Okay, I'm aware of time, so we'll wrap up with just some examples. Who are some examples of people who have been humble? Saul of Tarsus, right? So here's someone who very strongly believed one way, persecuted religious folks, has this transformative experience, becomes Paul. He changed his mind. Galileo and Copernicus, so the entire world was like, everything revolves around the earth, and they're like, well, it might revolve around the sun, and they're like, you need to go to prison, right? And they kind of They change their minds view based on empirical evidence. The third, this one's one of my favorite. The National Highway Safety Traffic Administration, I think, is actually humble. Some of you are like, is that a typo? What is he talking about? How many of you learned how to drive with your hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel? Anyone? Yes, I did too. I learned how to drive in a 1964 Nova station wagon, okay? Do you know what a 1964 Nova station wagon does not have that my car currently has right now? Airbags. What happens if you are at 10 and 2 and your airbag goes off? It hits you in the face, right? And after a few times of this situation, the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration said, you know what we should do? We should move it to 9 and 3. Because if you go from here, instead of hitting yourself in the face, when the airbag goes off, it blows it to the side. And so they changed their recommendation based on empirical evidence. Okay, so if you can't be like Paul or you can't be like Galileo, just be like the National Traffic Administration. All right. So humility is our ability to know ourselves, so acknowledge our limitations, the fallibility of our beliefs, to check ourselves, so to restrain our ego, our need for superiority and defensiveness, and go beyond ourselves. Listen, cultivate curiosity, be teachable, and seek to understand people's viewpoints. Thanks for listening. Thanks for allowing me to share a little bit about my book. If we have time, I'm happy to open the floor for shorter speeches disguised as questions. Thanks. Yes.
On? Yeah, okay. This is quick. There were 15 kindergartners on a street on which one of my kids was a kindergartner, and they all wanted to be first in line. And so there was a problem, and they assigned parents to supervise this. So the morning that I was supervising, Russell came up from another place first. And he just kind of hung around, and then other kids started to come. And I said, Russell, you were here first, so you could be first in line. And he looked at me and he said, I know, but what's so great about being first? So I'm wondering, was that a developmental thing for him that he could look at it that way? Or does parenting, where these days we're telling kids how good they are, even, when they come in last and stuff like that. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I certainly think that part of it I think part of what you're cueing in on is we have kind of bought into the myth that if we don't reinforce everybody's kind of overinflated ego, that they're just going to crumble. But I think that's actually doing the complete opposite of what we should be doing. Right, like if you're in third place, we shouldn't be like, that was great. Like you should be like, yeah, you were in third. There were 2 people that were faster than you. That is amazing. Look at all the people you were faster than, but you're still in third. And so we're worried that if people don't feel the absolute best, something's wrong with them. But what that does is it undermines our ability to deal with distress. Because when the harsh reality of the world teaches us that we are not the best or we're not in first, we're ill-equipped because we haven't developed those skills. So I think, again, a more accurate view of the world as it is instead of it should be, it would be helpful.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hi, I'm just sort of wondering if there's hope. So the practices you kind of laid out that can help us to become more humble, is there hope that those actually do make people or myself more humble?
Yeah, so is there any hope, or am I just kind of describing this pie in the sky because we're all kind of doomed? Well, I mean, so that is actually an empirical question. So my colleagues and I just about a year ago, we got a $6.5 million grant to study whether you could actually make people more humble. And so just in September, we brought out a bunch of scholars from different universities around the world to launch a series of projects that for the next 2.5 years, people are actually doing interventions to try to make people more humble, and we'll know more in about 2.5 years. Now, I will say in some of the research that I have done with some colleagues, this is cross-cultural research, so Hong Kong, Netherlands, United States, the percentage of people that are both humble and can hold their belief with commitment is in the single digit percentages. So it was about between 5 and 8%. And we did a number of studies, and it suggests that it's very, very hard to be committed to your beliefs and to be humble. Yeah, but we can be the best. We can be, of course, I can be in the 8%. Why not? Yeah.
You will understand when I say I'm reminded of David Myers and a speech he gave decades ago where he said, Jesus called us to follow him, not believe, to follow. And part of what he was articulating is that virtues are practices that become habits.
Yeah.
So I appreciate your suggestion that we need to practice these virtues.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Dave, as always, Dave's usually right. Yeah.
Well, in order to thank you most profusely, I think the thing that we might do is just to promise to pray for the patience to accept things that we can't change, the wisdom to know the difference with those things that we have the courage to change. And we appreciate your having reminded us of these things. Thank you.
Amen.